Blood Hollow earned its name. The night master Josiah Kellum's screams stopped echoing off its limestone walls. His body hung upside down from a towering pine. Entrails stretched across the mountain trail like crimson prayer flags in the Appalachian wind. This is the story of how 7 enslaved men transformed a Kentucky gorge into their personal courtroom, where justice wore the mask of ancient mountain terror and revenge carved its verdict into living flesh. The hollow sits carved into the Cumberland Mountains like a knife wound that never healed. Even today, locals claim the gorge swallows sound, that voices vanish into its depths without echo. The creek runs black as coal runoff, trickling between moss-covered boulders that stand like silent witnesses to what happened in 1852. When wind moves through the pines overhead, it carries something heavier than mountain air. Before I tell you what those 7 men did in that hollow, I need to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in Kentucky courthouse records for over a century. The Kellum plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of tobacco fields outside Hazard, where Troublesome Creek carved its path toward the Kentucky River. Master Josiah ruled his domain with calculated brutality, believing fear kept his 43 enslaved workers productive. His overseer, Samuel Briggs, enforced discipline with a bullwhip made from braided rawhide, its 9 tails stained brown from repeated use. 7 men worked the furthest fields, clearing stumps and breaking new ground for spring planting. They called themselves the Iron Gang, not for their tools, but for their resolve. Moses led them, a blacksmith whose shoulders could bear anvils and whose hands could shape metal or break bones. Alongside him worked Ezra, quick with numbers and quicker with knives. Thomas carved wood with the precision of a surgeon. Benjamin tracked game through forests, thick as midnight. Samuel knew every plant that healed and every root that killed. Jacob built things meant to last forever. And Daniel sang work songs that made the hardest labor bearable. The Iron Gang whispered freedom during tobacco harvest, planning escape routes through mountains that could hide armies. They'd studied the hollow for months, noting its hidden caves and treacherous paths. Blood Hollow offered the perfect sanctuary, a place where even experienced hunters lost their way. From the diary of Sarah Kellum, Josiah's wife, dated October 15, 1852, the 7 field hands vanished in the night. Josiah rages like thunder itself. He vows to bring them back in chains or bring back their heads. The escape happened during the first frost of October. 7 shadows slipped past sleeping quarters and vanished into mountain darkness, thick enough to hide sins. By dawn, Josiah discovered their absence and assembled his hunting party. 3 neighbors joined him, each bringing dogs trained to track human scent. They carried rope, chains, and firearms, expecting to corner desperate runaways within hours. But the Iron Gang had vanished like smoke. The hunters followed tracks to Blood Hollow's entrance, where the trail seemed to swallow itself. Dogs whined and refused to enter, their hackles raised against something that transcended scent. Josiah forced the party forward, his pride wounded by enslaved men who dared defy his authority. The hollow's mouth yawned 40 feet wide, its walls rising straight up like cathedral stones. Creek water gurgled invisible beneath fallen logs and scattered boulders. Pine needles carpeted the ground so thick that footsteps made no sound. The silence pressed against eardrums like cotton stuffed too deep. What the hunters didn't know was that 7 men had spent months preparing this killing ground. They'd memorized every stone, every hiding place, every weakness in the hollow's natural defenses. Moses had forged weapons in secret, heating metal over carefully concealed fires. Ezra had calculated angles and distances with mathematical precision. The others had prepared in their own ways, transforming survival skills into warfare. The hunting party pressed deeper into the gorge, following tracks that seemed deliberately placed. Josiah led with arrogant confidence, his rifle ready for the moment he spotted his escaped property. Behind him, the neighbors grew increasingly uneasy as shadows lengthened and the hollow's walls rose higher. They never saw the first attack coming. A rope snare caught Josiah's ankle, yanking him skyward with mechanical precision. Jacob's engineering had created a counterweight system using boulders and pulleys fashioned from carved wood. As Josiah hung upside down, rifle clattering to the ground, 7 figures emerged from positions they'd held motionless for hours. But this was only the beginning. What happened next in Blood Hollow would transform 7 desperate fugitives into legends whispered around Appalachian fires for generations. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Iron Gang was about to teach their master the true meaning of fear. How do you think it feels to realize the people you've owned as property have spent months planning your execution? When the rope tightens and the world turns upside down, what goes through a man's mind as he stares into the faces of those he's brutalized, knowing they hold complete power over his final moments? The screaming was about to begin, and Blood Hollow would earn its name in ways that would echo through Kentucky folklore forever. Josiah Kellum twisted in the air like a hanged man, blood rushing to his head as the rope bit deep into his ankle. The rifle he'd carried so confidently lay useless in pine needles below. The Iron Gang had transformed Blood Hollow into an execution chamber, where 18 years of accumulated rage would finally find its voice. Moses stepped forward first, his blacksmith's hammer catching what little light filtered through the canopy. Behind him, the others emerged from hiding spots they'd occupied since before dawn. Ezra materialized from behind a moss-covered boulder, his carved wooden spear gleaming with pine resin. Thomas rose from a depression in the creek bank, water dripping from clothes that had kept him invisible among the shadows. Benjamin appeared on the hollow's rim, 40 feet above, bow drawn and arrow nocked. Samuel, Daniel, and Jacob completed the circle, each man positioned with mathematical precision. The 3 neighbors who joined Josiah's hunting party found themselves facing weapons they'd never seen before. Jacob had spent months crafting specialized tools, combining his carpentry skills with Moses' metalwork, crossbows made from hickory and iron, spears tipped with steel points forged in secret midnight fires, snares designed to catch men instead of rabbits. "You boys made a mistake," Josiah wheezed, his face purpling as blood pooled in his skull. "Cut me down and I might go easy on the whippings." Moses laughed, a sound like coal settling in a furnace. "Master Kellum, you ain't giving orders no more." The first neighbor, a tobacco farmer named Crawford, raised his shotgun toward Moses. Benjamin's arrow took him through the shoulder, spinning him sideways into the creek. The splash echoed off hollow walls like thunder in a bottle. Crawford's weapon discharged into empty air, the blast absorbed by limestone cliffs that seemed to swallow sound itself. The second neighbor dropped his rifle and raised his hands. The third turned to run and found Daniel blocking his path, singing a work song in a voice sweet as honey and cold as mountain snow. From the journal of Dr. Marcus Webb, who examined the scene days later, the preparation evident in this ambush suggests months of planning. These men had studied warfare, not just rebellion. What followed wasn't random violence, but calculated justice administered by men who'd endured systematic brutality for decades. The Iron Gang had witnessed Josiah whip pregnant women until they miscarried. They'd seen him sell children away from mothers for gambling debts. They'd watched him brand human flesh like cattle hide and call it civilization. Ezra approached the surviving neighbors with his spear held low. "You got a choice," he said quietly. "Walk out of this hollow and forget you saw anything, or stay and join your friend in the creek." One neighbor scrambled up the slope, crashing through underbrush in his desperation to escape. The other hesitated, loyalty to Josiah warring with self-preservation. That hesitation cost him everything. Jacob's crossbow bolt took him center mass, dropping him beside Crawford's still form. Justice carved in steel and wood. Now only Josiah remained, swaying in his rope prison, while 7 freed men decided his fate. The overseer, Samuel Briggs, hadn't joined the hunting party, claiming illness. Later investigation would reveal he'd been warned by a house servant, choosing discretion over duty when faced with the Iron Gang's reputation for thorough planning. Moses began sharpening his hammer's edge against a whetstone, each stroke ringing like a funeral bell through the hollow's silence. 18 years I've been your property, he said conversationally. 18 years you owned my hands, my back, my sweat, but you never owned my mind. Josiah tried bargaining, offering freedom, money, anything to escape the fate he saw approaching in Moses' eyes. But the Iron Gang had moved beyond negotiation into the realm of biblical justice. An eye for an eye, a life for lives destroyed. Thomas produced his carving knives, their blades honed to surgical sharpness. "Remember when you sold my boy to the sugar plantation?" he asked, almost gently. "Said he was getting too smart? Might cause trouble?" The hollow wall seemed to lean inward, creating an amphitheater for this trial where verdict had already been decided. Daniel's singing grew louder, work songs transforming into something older, more primal. African rhythms that predated slavery, carried in memory across oceans and generations. Benjamin climbed down from his perch, his remaining arrows ready for any unexpected visitors. Samuel gathered plants from the creek bank, selecting species with deliberate care. Jacob checked his snares and mechanical devices, ensuring no escape routes remained available. The execution was about to begin, methodical and ceremonial, conducted according to rules the Iron Gang had written in their own blood and sweat. But what they did to Josiah Kellum would transcend mere revenge, becoming something darker and more permanent. How do you measure justice when the scales have been broken for generations? When law exists only to protect property, and you've been legally classified as property yourself, what court remains except the one you create in mountain shadows? The real horror wasn't what 7 enslaved men were about to do to their master, but what 18 years of systematic dehumanization had forced them to become. Moses raised his hammer above Josiah's inverted form, its iron head catching fragments of sunlight that pierced the hollow's canopy. The master who had owned human beings like livestock was about to learn what it meant to be powerless. This execution would follow rituals older than slavery itself, administered by men who had studied their oppressors' weaknesses for nearly 2 decades. The Iron Gang had planned this moment with surgical precision. Each man carried specific responsibilities in what would unfold as both execution and ceremony. Thomas positioned his carving tools in a neat row on a flat stone, their edges gleaming like altarpieces. Samuel arranged his selected plants beside a small fire Jacob had prepared using flint and tinder. Daniel's singing shifted into rhythms that seemed to make the hollow's walls pulse with ancient memory. Josiah's struggles had weakened as blood continued pooling in his skull, but his voice remained strong enough for curses and desperate bargains. "My neighbors know where I went," he gasped. "They'll come looking when I don't return." "2 of your neighbors ain't going nowhere," Ezra replied, gesturing toward the bodies by the creek. "The 3rd one might make it back to town, might not. These mountains got their own ways of settling accounts." Benjamin checked his remaining arrows, positioning himself where he could monitor all approaches to the hollow. His years tracking game had taught him how sounds traveled through mountain air, how to distinguish between wind-blown branches and approaching footsteps. The silence remained complete except for creek water and Josiah's labored breathing. The execution began with Moses reciting names. Each blow of his hammer punctuated another life Josiah had destroyed through sale, punishment, or deliberate neglect. "This one's for Ruth, worked to death birthing tobacco. Crack. This one's for little Sam, sold away at age 7. Crack. This one's for Mary, whipped until her back wouldn't heal. Crack." From Kentucky State Archives, October 20th, 1852. Search party found Master Kellum's remains suspended from pine tree. Manner of death suggests prolonged torture. No trace of escaped slaves. Thomas began his work with surgical precision, using techniques learned from watching plantation doctors treat injured horses. His blade work was methodical, designed to maintain consciousness while inflicting maximum suffering. The carving tools moved with artist skill, creating patterns that would later puzzle investigators who assumed random violence. Samuel's plant knowledge proved invaluable in prolonging the proceedings. Certain roots could prevent shock, keeping victims alert longer than nature intended. Other herbs dulled pain, just enough to extend awareness without providing mercy. He administered these botanical cocktails with the same care he'd once used treating sick slaves, though his motivation had shifted from healing to punishment. Daniel's singing provided soundtrack to justice, his voice rising and falling with ceremonial timing. The work songs transformed into something older, carrying melodies his grandmother had hummed while picking cotton under Georgian Sunday. African rhythms that connected this mountain hollow to ancestral lands where similar ceremonies had once balanced community scales. The ritual lasted until sunset painted Blood Hollow's walls crimson. By then, Josiah Kellum existed in a state between consciousness and madness, his body bearing marks that would tell the Iron Gang's story to anyone who understood their symbolic language. Each cut, each broken bone, each carefully inflicted wound represented specific crimes against humanity. Jacob's engineering skills proved essential for the final display. Using rope and pulleys, he positioned Josiah's body in a configuration that would maximize psychological impact on whoever discovered it. The arrangement followed patterns found in certain African tribal justice ceremonies, though twisted through the lens of slavery's particular brutalities. As darkness settled over the hollow, the 7 men began their true escape. They'd spent months caching supplies in caves that honeycombed the limestone cliffs. Food, weapons, tools, everything needed for extended survival in mountain wilderness. This wasn't desperate flight, but strategic withdrawal to prepared positions. Moses extinguished their fire, scattering ashes while Thomas cleaned his tools with creek water. Samuel gathered his remaining plants, selecting species that grew only in high mountain meadows where they planned to establish temporary camps. Benjamin erased footprints using techniques learned from Cherokee hunters who'd once roamed these same ridges. The hollow fell silent again, its walls keeping secrets that would outlive generations. Josiah's body swayed gently in night wind, positioned to create maximum terror for whoever found it first. His entrails had been arranged across the trail according to patterns that served both practical and psychological purposes. Blood painted on bark told stories. By morning, the Iron Gang had vanished into Cumberland peaks like smoke absorbed by stone. They left behind a crime scene, calculated to spread fear through every plantation in eastern Kentucky, a message written in flesh and blood that some property could think, plan, and execute justice according to its own terrible logic. But their flight through treacherous mountain terrain would test survival skills learned through decades of bondage. 7 men carrying freedom's weight against pursuers who commanded resources, weapons, and legal authority to kill runaways on sight. What happens when escaped slaves transform from property into predators, using masters' own brutality as textbook for their wilderness justice? How long can 7 men survive in mountains where winter kills the unprepared, and civilization offers no sanctuary to those born without freedom? The real chase was just beginning, and Blood Hollow had taught the Iron Gang that terror could be harvested like any other crop. The discovery came at dawn, when young Timothy Crawford found his father's body floating face down in Blood Hollow's creek. The boy's screams echoed off limestone walls for the first time in decades, breaking the silence like shattered glass. What followed would become the largest manhunt in Kentucky history, as word spread that enslaved men had not just escaped, but executed their master with ceremonial precision. Sheriff William Donovan arrived at Blood Hollow by mid-morning, accompanied by the county coroner and 3 deputies armed with rifles, and grim determination. The scene that greeted them defied their experience with typical slave rebellions. This wasn't desperate violence born of opportunity, but calculated warfare conducted according to principles they couldn't comprehend. Josiah's body hung exactly as the Iron Gang had positioned it, each detail designed to maximize psychological impact. The coroner, Dr. Marcus Webb, examined the remains with scientific detachment that gradually gave way to horrified fascination. The wounds followed, patterns suggesting knowledge of human anatomy beyond what plantation slaves should possess. The arrangement of entrails across the trail created symbols that seemed deliberate, though their meaning remained obscure to white observers. They knew what they were doing, Webb muttered, making notes in his leather-bound journal. This wasn't random butchery. This was surgery. 2 other bodies lay partially submerged in the creek where they'd fallen during the ambush. Crawford and his neighbor bore wounds from weapons that shouldn't exist in slave quarters. Crossbow bolts carved from hickory and tipped with forged steel. Spear points shaped with precision that suggested access to proper metalworking tools. Arrows fletched with turkey feathers and balanced for accuracy. From Sheriff Donovan's official report, October 21st, 1852, evidence suggests escaped slaves had been preparing this ambush for months. Sophisticated weapons and tactical knowledge indicate outside assistance or previous military experience. The manhunt began immediately, drawing volunteer posses from 3 counties. Plantation owners feared the Iron Gang's example might inspire copycat rebellions across eastern Kentucky. Telegraph messages raced between towns, alerting authorities to watch for 7 black men traveling together. Rewards totaling $500 were posted for their capture, dead or alive. But the Iron Gang had vanished into Cumberland wilderness, like smoke absorbed by stone. They'd prepared mountain hideouts using techniques learned from Cherokee hunters who'd once roamed these same ridges before their own forced removal. Caves provided shelter, hidden springs offered water, and cached supplies ensured survival through winter months. Professional slave hunters joined the search, men who specialized in tracking human prey through impossible terrain. They brought dogs trained to follow scent across water and stone, horses bred for mountain travel, and experience hunting the most dangerous game of all. The leader, a scarred veteran named Marcus Briggs, boasted of never losing a runaway who'd made it past the Ohio River. The first week produced nothing but false leads and frustrated searchers. Tracking dogs lost the scent at creek beds, where the Iron Gang had used techniques learned from Benjamin's hunting experience. They'd rubbed themselves with plants that confused animal noses, walked backwards through shallow water, and split up to create multiple false trails that led nowhere. Meanwhile, panic spread through plantation communities like wildfire through dried tobacco. House slaves found themselves watched with fresh suspicion. Kitchen knives disappeared from sight. Overseers slept with loaded weapons beside their beds. Some plantation owners dismissed their entire domestic staffs, preferring hunger to the possibility of poison in their evening meals. The Iron Gang exploited this paranoia through psychological warfare that required no direct contact. They left signs of their presence near isolated farms, carved symbols on fence posts, animal bones arranged in patterns, small fires that appeared and disappeared like spirits. Each incident spread fear exponentially, creating the impression that the 7 men possessed supernatural abilities. Moses led their mobile warfare campaign with strategic brilliance learned through 18 years of studying his oppressors' weaknesses. He'd observed how white men thought, how they reacted to threats, how their assumptions could be turned against them. The Iron Gang struck at symbols rather than people, burning empty slave quarters, destroying cotton gins, poisoning water sources used for livestock. Towns began hiring armed guards for night watch duty. Plantation owners organized mutual defense packs, promising to assist neighbors facing slave rebellions. The Kentucky legislature discussed emergency measures for dealing with what newspapers called the most dangerous band of Negro insurrectionists in state history. But winter was approaching, and mountain weather would test the Iron Gang's survival skills against pursuers who could retreat to warm beds and steady meals. The 7 men faced choices that would determine whether their flight ended in freedom or frozen corpses discovered by spring hunters. They'd transformed from property into legends, but legends require believers to survive. In cabin whispers and field conversations, enslaved people throughout eastern Kentucky spoke of 7 men who'd killed their master and escaped into mountains where even bloodhounds lost their trail. The mountains themselves seemed complicit. What happens when the hunted become hunters, using terrain and weather as weapons against those who claim to own them? How long can 7 men survive winter in wilderness that kills the unprepared while armed posses search with legal authority to shoot on sight? The Iron Gang was about to learn that freedom's price could be measured in more than blood, and that even the most carefully planned rebellion faces tests no amount of preparation can anticipate. Snow began falling on November 15th, transforming the Cumberland Mountains into a crystalline prison where survival depended on preparation the Iron Gang had spent months perfecting. Each flake that settled on pine branches brought them closer to either freedom or frozen death. Winter in Appalachian peaks separates the merely desperate from the truly committed, and 7 escaped slaves were about to face nature's harshest examination. The Iron Gang had established their primary camp in a limestone cave system discovered during Benjamin's hunting expeditions the previous spring. The caverns extended deep into the mountain's heart, providing shelter from wind and concealment from searchers. Moses had cached iron tools and weapon-making materials in the deepest chambers. Samuel had stored medicinal plants dried and bundled against winter's illnesses. Jacob had prepared fuel supplies, splitting and stacking deadwood in quantities calculated to last until spring thaw. Their cave network connected through passages that allowed movement between multiple entrances, each opening camouflaged with techniques learned from Cherokee, stories passed down through enslaved communities. Benjamin had mapped every tunnel, marking safe routes and dangerous drops with carved symbols only the 7 men could read. The pursuing posses faced different challenges. Sheriff Donovan's men could retreat to warm beds and steady meals, but their tracking efforts became increasingly futile as snow obscured footprints and scent trails. Professional slave hunters commanded higher fees during winter months, understanding that mountain weather killed searchers as efficiently as it killed fugitives. From the diary of Martha Kellum, Josiah's widow, November 20th, 1852. The children wake screaming from dreams of 7 devils in the mountains. I sleep with father's pistol beneath my pillow, though I know bullets cannot kill what haunts these hills. Marcus Briggs, the scarred slave hunter, dismissed his tracking dogs after losing 2 animals to mountain lions and a third to hypothermia. His horses struggled through deepening snow, their breath steaming in air cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. The $500 reward seemed inadequate compensation for risking death in terrain that favored the hunted over the hunters. But the Iron Gang faced their own deadly arithmetic. 7 men required significant food supplies to survive winter months when hunting became difficult and gathering impossible. Their cached provisions would last until February if carefully rationed, longer if supplemented with game. Benjamin's tracking skills proved essential, though his arrows had to be recovered and reused, since replacing them meant exposing their position to forge new points. Daniel's singing grew quieter as winter deepened, his voice preserving energy for survival rather than ceremony. But on windless nights, when sound carried far through frozen air, searchers reported hearing ghostly melodies echoing from mountain peaks. These phantom songs spread fear among pursuing posses, suggesting the Iron Gang possessed supernatural abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The psychological warfare continued through calculated appearances that maximized terror while minimizing risk. Thomas carved symbols into trees near abandoned homesteads, his artistic skills creating images that seemed to move in firelight. Samuel left plant arrangements that resembled ritual offerings, though their actual purpose involved marking supply caches and safe routes. December brought blizzards that trapped both hunters and hunted in their respective positions. The Iron Gang's cave system proved its worth as temperatures plummeted below what human bodies could survive without shelter. Their fires remained invisible from outside, smoke dispersing through natural chimneys that Jacob had mapped during autumn scouting expeditions. Sheriff Donovan suspended active search operations until spring, admitting defeat against weather conditions that killed experienced woodsmen. The professional slave hunters retreated to Louisville, claiming the Iron Gang had likely frozen to death in caves that would reveal their bones when snow melted. Rewards remained posted, but active pursuit ceased. This winter respite allowed the 7 men to plan their next phase of operations. Moses understood that survival alone wouldn't achieve their ultimate goal of permanent freedom. They needed to reach territories where slavery couldn't legally pursue them, or establish such fearsome reputations that future escape attempts became unnecessary. Ezra calculated distances and supply requirements for possible routes north. The Underground Railroad operated stations in Ohio, but reaching them meant crossing hundreds of miles through hostile territory. Canada offered true sanctuary, but lay even further beyond mountain barriers that had already tested their survival skills. Winter nights stretched endlessly in cave darkness, broken only by carefully rationed firelight. The 7 men told stories, shared memories, and planned campaigns for spring warfare against the system that had owned their bodies but never conquered their spirits. Their brotherhood had been forged in tobacco fields and tempered in Blood Hollow's crucible. Mountain silence pressed against their ears. As February approached and food supplies dwindled, the Iron Gang faced decisions that would determine whether they emerged from winter as legends or corpses. The mountains had protected them from human pursuers, but demanded payment in suffering that tested bonds forged through shared oppression. What happens when survival requires choices between individual preservation and group loyalty? When 7 men discover that freedom's mathematics include calculations no one wants to make, but winter's cruel arithmetic demands answers written in frozen blood, the spring thaw would reveal which debts the Iron Gang had paid and which prices they still owed to mountains that kept their secrets buried beneath snow. Spring melt began in late March, sending torrents of ice-cold water cascading down Blood Hollow's walls like tears from stone eyes. The Iron Gang emerged from their winter caves gaunt but alive, 7 shadows who had survived what killed most men. Their reappearance would shatter the illusion that winter had solved Kentucky's most dangerous problem, proving that some fires burned too hot for mountain cold to extinguish. The 7 men had lost weight during their cave hibernation, but their bond had strengthened through shared hardship that would have broken weaker alliances. Moses still carried his blacksmith's hammer, its handle worn smooth by months of grip. Thomas had carved new tools from salvaged metal and mountain hardwood. Benjamin's arrows numbered fewer than autumn, but each shaft was perfectly balanced through winter's careful craftsmanship. Samuel had spent frozen months studying plant lore, passed down through generations of enslaved healers, memorizing which mountain species could heal wounds, prevent infection, or provide other services to men who couldn't visit doctors. His knowledge would prove essential as spring brought renewed conflict with pursuers who assumed the Iron Gang had perished in winter storms. Their first spring raid targeted an isolated homestead where a known slave catcher named Willis kept his tracking dogs and equipment. The attack came at dawn on April 8th, executed with precision that demonstrated winter's lessons. No lives were taken, but the psychological impact spread fear more effectively than random violence. Willis discovered his dogs released, his weapons broken, and a message carved into his cabin door. 7 devils still walk these hills. Tell your friends. The carved letters matched symbols found at previous Iron Gang sites, confirming that the most wanted fugitives in Kentucky history had survived winter and returned to active warfare. From the Louisville Daily Journal, April 12, 1853. Reports confirm the notorious Iron Gang remains at large in eastern Kentucky mountains. Governor calls for federal assistance in capturing these dangerous insurrectionists. The renewed manhunt brought military involvement for the first time. Federal troops stationed at Fort Knox received orders to assist local authorities in tracking 7 escaped slaves whose rebellion had inspired copycat incidents across 3 states. Their commanding officer, Major Robert Hayes, approached the mission with professional interest rather than emotional investment. "These aren't typical runaways," Hayes wrote in his official report. "They demonstrate tactical knowledge and organizational skills that suggest military training or natural leadership abilities. Standard tracking methods have proven ineffective against their countermeasures." The Iron Gang had indeed learned from winter's harsh education. They moved in smaller groups, never more than 3 men together, communicating through coded symbols left at predetermined locations. Their supply system expanded to include sympathetic mountain families who provided food and information in exchange for protection from raiders and desperados who plagued isolated settlements. Benjamin's hunting skills had evolved beyond tracking game to reading human behavior from subtle signs. He could determine the size and composition of pursuing parties by examining footprints, estimate their supplies by studying campsites, and predict their likely routes based on terrain analysis. This intelligence allowed the Iron Gang to stay ahead of searchers while planning their own operations. The psychological warfare intensified as spring progressed. Thomas created increasingly elaborate carved messages that appeared overnight on prominent trees near county seats and plantation houses. His artistic ability transformed simple threats into haunting artworks that seemed to watch observers with malevolent intelligence. Daniel's voice returned stronger after winter's silence, his songs now carrying notes of triumph rather than mere survival. Travelers reported hearing ghostly melodies from empty valleys. Work songs transformed into victory anthems that celebrated resistance rather than endurance. One incident particularly unnerved the pursuing forces. A military patrol discovered their camp surrounded by carved symbols that had appeared silently during the night while sentries stood guard. No one had seen or heard the artists, yet elaborate designs decorated every tree within 50 yards of their position. The message was clear. The Iron Gang could approach undetected and withdraw unseen, making any camp vulnerable to attack. Major Hayes increased patrols and offered substantial rewards for information leading to the fugitives' capture. But mountain communities had begun viewing the Iron Gang as folk heroes rather than criminals. Their careful avoidance of civilian casualties, combined with systematic targeting of slave catchers and cruel overseers, earned grudging respect from people who understood oppression. The 7 men had transcended their origins as escape property to become symbols of resistance that inspired enslaved people throughout the region. Their example demonstrated that masters weren't invincible, that careful planning could overcome superior resources, and that freedom was worth any risk. Spring's arrival had awakened more than seasonal cycles. The Iron Gang survival proved that some rebellions couldn't be crushed by weather, weapons, or overwhelming force. Their story spread through whispered conversations and coded spirituals, carrying messages of hope to those still bound by chains. But success brought new dangers as federal involvement escalated the conflict beyond local law enforcement capabilities. Professional soldiers with military training and unlimited resources were joining the hunt, transforming a regional problem into a national crisis. How do 7 escaped slaves evade an entire military apparatus designed to crush rebellion? What happens when folk heroes discover that legends attract attention from forces more dangerous than any individual master or local sheriff? The Iron Gang was about to learn that their greatest victory might have set the stage for their ultimate test against opponents who understood warfare as well as they understood survival. Major Robert Hayes studied the topographical maps spread across his field desk as morning mist rose from valley floors like ghostly accusations. His orders were clear: capture or kill the Iron Gang before the rebellion inspired nationwide slave uprisings. The federal government had decided that 7 escaped slaves posed a greater threat to national stability than entire Confederate battalions would a decade later. Hayes commanded 2 companies of experienced soldiers, men who'd fought Mexican war battles and understood mountain warfare. Their equipment included the latest rifled muskets, professional tracking gear, and communication systems that connected field units through signal fires and coded messages. This wasn't local law enforcement stumbling through unfamiliar terrain, but military precision applied to human hunting. The Major's strategy differed fundamentally from previous attempts. Instead of chasing the Iron Gang through mountains, he planned to trap them using systematic area denial. His troops would establish permanent camps at strategic locations, controlling water sources, supply routes, and escape paths until the fugitives faced starvation or surrender. These men have survived by staying mobile, Hayes explained to his officers during their April planning session. We'll force them into static positions where our superior firepower can be effectively applied. The Iron Gang quickly recognized the changed nature of their opposition. Benjamin's reconnaissance revealed military camps positioned with mathematical precision, cutting off traditional movement routes between safe areas. Moses understood they faced trained soldiers rather than amateur bounty hunters, men who thought strategically rather than emotionally. From Major Hayes's field reports, May 2nd, 1853, enemy demonstrates sophisticated understanding of guerrilla warfare principles. Their tactics suggest formal military training impossible for escaped slaves to possess through normal channels. The 7 men adapted by fragmenting into even smaller units, never more than 2 together, communicating through symbols that evolved daily to prevent military codebreakers from deciphering their messages. Samuel's plant knowledge became crucial for maintaining health without access to traditional medical care, while Thomas carved increasingly subtle markers that military patrols couldn't distinguish from natural forest signs. Their supply network faced systematic disruption as federal troops interrogated mountain families suspected of providing assistance. Some supporters were arrested on charges of harboring fugitive slaves, creating fear that broke previously reliable connections. The Iron Gang found themselves increasingly isolated from civilian aid that had sustained them through winter months. Daniel's songs changed again, becoming whispered melodies that carried warnings rather than celebrations. His voice could reach incredible distances through mountain acoustics, alerting scattered gang members to approaching patrols or changing military positions. The soldiers learned to recognize these phantom communications, but couldn't locate their source or decode their meanings. The first direct confrontation occurred on May 15th, near Devil's Creek, where Benjamin and Jacob encountered a 6-man patrol during a water resupply mission. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, but demonstrated the gap between military training and desperate survival skills honed through years of oppression. Benjamin's first arrow took the patrol leader through the throat before the soldiers realized they were under attack. Jacob's crossbow dropped a second man, while the survivors scrambled for cover behind fallen logs. The remaining soldiers returned disciplined volleys that splintered bark inches from their targets. But the Iron Gang members had already withdrawn, using terrain knowledge their opponents couldn't match. 2 soldiers died in that brief firefight, the first military casualties of what newspapers began calling the Kentucky Mountain War. Federal response escalated immediately, with additional troops dispatched from 3 states and rewards increased to unprecedented levels. Hayes implemented increasingly harsh measures against civilian populations suspected of aiding the fugitives. Mountain families faced interrogations, property searches, and threats of prosecution under federal fugitive slave laws. This heavy-handed approach gradually turned potential allies into active resistors who viewed federal troops as occupying forces rather than lawful authorities. The Iron Gang exploited this growing resentment by positioning themselves as defenders of mountain independence against federal intrusion. Their carefully targeted raids focused on military supply lines rather than civilian targets, earning grudging respect from communities that valued self-reliance above legal authority. Moses coordinated these operations with strategic brilliance that frustrated professional soldiers accustomed to conventional warfare. The Iron Gang struck at night, hit isolated positions, and vanished before reinforcements could respond. Their intimate knowledge of terrain allowed movement through areas military maps marked as impassable. Summer heat began affecting military operations as soldiers struggled with equipment designed for conventional battles rather than mountain pursuit. Heavy uniforms and standard-issue gear proved inadequate for the prolonged tracking required to corner opponents who traveled light and lived off the land. The psychological impact on federal troops became increasingly evident as casualties mounted without corresponding success in capturing targets. Soldiers reported hearing voices in empty valleys, finding camps surrounded by mysterious symbols, and discovering equipment damaged by invisible opponents who struck without warning. What happens when the most powerful military in the world mobilizes against 7 escaped slaves who refuse to accept defeat? How do trained soldiers maintain morale while hunting opponents who seem to vanish like mountain mist, leaving behind only carved warnings and dead comrades? The Iron Gang had survived winter's test and spring's renewal, but summer would bring the final examination of their resolve against forces that commanded unlimited resources and legal authority to kill anyone who stood in their way. The trap closed on August 7, 1853, when Major Hayes received intelligence that would end the Kentucky Mountain War in blood and legend. A captured deserter revealed the location of Moses' Forge, hidden in a cave system the Iron Gang had used as their primary weapons depot. 7 men who had defied an empire were about to face their final examination in the crucible where their rebellion was born. Federal forces surrounded the cave network before dawn, positioning soldiers at every known entrance, while artillery crews prepared charges designed to seal the tunnels permanently. Hayes had learned from previous failures, bringing overwhelming force to bear on a fixed position where the Iron Gang's mobility advantages couldn't save them. Moses detected the encirclement through vibrations carried by stone, the mountain itself warning of approaching doom. He roused his scattered brothers through coded signals that echoed through limestone passages, calling them home for what everyone understood would be their last stand together. The 7 men gathered in their forge chamber, surrounded by weapons they'd created during months of hidden labor. Hammers, spears, crossbows, and arrows represented thousands of hours spent transforming raw metal into instruments of rebellion. The cave walls bore carved symbols documenting their journey from property to predators to legends. "We knew this day would come," Moses said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 18 years spent planning this moment. "Question is whether we die as slaves or free men." The answer came in actions rather than words. Thomas sharpened his carving knives with ceremonial precision. Benjamin checked his bowstring tension and arrow fletching. Samuel mixed his final plant preparations. Substances that could heal wounds or ensure death came quickly if capture seemed inevitable. Daniel began singing, his voice filling the chamber with melodies that had sustained them through every trial. From Major Hayes' final report, August 7, 1853, subjects refused surrender demands. Artillery bombardment commenced at 0700 hours. Cave system sealed, with all occupants inside. The siege lasted 13 hours, with federal forces maintaining constant pressure on every escape route. While explosive charges gradually collapsed tunnel systems, the Iron Gang had called home for over a year. Smoke from their forge fire leaked through cracks in limestone, creating ghostly wisps that seemed to carry spirits ascending from mountain depths. Local witnesses reported hearing Daniel's voice until the very end, work songs transforming into something that transcended human vocal range. His final melody echoed from sealed stone like the mountain itself, mourning 7 men who'd chosen death over submission. The cave-in was complete. By sunset, tons of limestone ceiling chambers that contained the bodies, weapons, and tools of the most successful slave rebellion in Kentucky history. Major Hayes declared victory and withdrew his troops, confident that the Iron Gang threat had been permanently eliminated. But mountains keep secrets longer than men keep promises. Searchers never found bodies, never recovered weapons, never confirmed that 7 men had actually died in the sealed caves. The limestone labyrinth extended deeper than military maps indicated, connecting to passages that might lead anywhere or nowhere. Winter storms that year brought strange phenomena to Blood Hollow and surrounding peaks. Travelers reported seeing figures moving through blizzards, hearing forge hammers ringing from empty valleys, finding carved symbols that appeared overnight on prominent trees. Federal authorities dismissed these reports as folklore born from local superstition. The Iron Gang had become something beyond life or death, beyond capture or freedom. Their story spread through whispered conversations and coded spirituals, inspiring enslaved people throughout the South, while terrifying masters who realized that property could think, plan, and execute justice according to its own terrible logic. Blood carved in mountain stone. What happens when 7 escaped slaves transcend mortality to become myths that outlive the system they defied? When legends prove more dangerous than living men, inspiring generations of rebels who carry their tools and techniques into battles yet to come? The Civil War would begin 8 years later, fought partly by men who'd learned resistance from stories carved in Cumberland limestone. The Iron Gang's techniques would spread through underground railroad networks. Their tactical knowledge, preserved in communities that understood survival, meant more than simply staying alive. Even today, hikers in Blood Hollow report finding metal fragments buried in creek beds, carved symbols on ancient trees, and cave entrances that seem to lead deeper into the mountain than geology should allow. Local folklore claims the Iron Gang still walks these ridges, 7 shadows protecting runaways and punishing those who would own human beings like livestock. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.